we're recording it so that people who aren't here can watch it.
Shall we start?
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Yeah?
To go ahead and start, yeah.
Okay. All right, so those of you who don't know me, my name is Atia. I have been, I was one of the founding members of Platypus. So I'll just talk a little bit about what is Platypus. An political Marxist organization that started as a project of education about the history of the left in 2006.
There you go.
And it kind of emerged out of our discontent with the existing left. The context was the Iraq War. And we were kind of very unhappy about the responses that were being generated by the left and on the left on the war in Iraq. So we started this little reading group. It started off at the School of the Art Institute and by mostly also the University of Chicago students. And it started off as a reading group and still is a reading group. And so the point is to actually educate ourselves on the history of Marxism in order to understand and make sense of our present context. So I teach the reading group at the University of Chicago, but now Platypus is an international organization. It has, 17 chapters, something like that. We have a website where you can learn a lot more about our engagements with the left in the form of public fora, also about the various reading groups that exist in Europe and America. But it is largely a student organization. So we start chapters. It's a chapter organization on campuses. So now, so why the authoritarian personality? So after the elections last year, there was, again, I think there was a lot of discontent in Platypus as well about the response to the results of the elections, and especially the response to Trump. And a lot of bad articles, I think, were being written on the authoritarian personality. Especially one that kind of stuck out was in the New Yorker by Alex Ross. It was a terrible article. Had a very one-sided perspective on the authoritarian personality. And I thought perhaps, we could do a small talk and kind of make sense of what that means. And also in the Platypus Review, which is our newspaper, number 91, specifically dealt with this question and the concept of the authoritarian personality.
There's somebody coming with that, so later we'll be able
great.
to have the PR if you are interested.
Yeah, no, that would be great. So the readings for today were posted from that issue, as well as one article by Peter Gordon on, who takes inspiration from the authoritarian personality and tries to analyze the phenomenon of Trump. But I would also like to start by situating the question of the authoritarian personality in a historical context. And there's one figure that we read in the reading group is Wilhelm Reich, who wrote this piece called Ideology as Material Force or Material Power. It's an interesting piece because it kind of grapples with this conception in the 20th century. This conception as a phenomenon of the 20th century, the authoritarian personality or authoritarianism. And it does so in the context or in the post-war, sort of in the 1920s, with the defeat of the German left. So the question that emerged for Reich was, why did Marxism fail? Why did the workers vote for the Nazis? And he actually draws upon Freudian insights in order to explain the psychology of authoritarianism. And one notion that is really interesting is, in that piece, is this regressive fear of freedom. So what is it? Why is it that people actually act against their self-interest instead of fighting for emancipation or getting involved in a revolution? They actually, affirm the status quo and they support the status quo. So what happened to Marxism in that moment? Why was it unable to tap into this sense? And whereas the Nazis actually were able to make sense of the change that was occurring in society, albeit unconsciously and very incoherently, they did so. Whereas the Marxists, they didn't. So Reich actually poses the question of authoritarianism as a social problem. And so what is really important is to understand or make sense of this phenomenon of the 20th century, which then was later elaborated by the Frankfurt School theorists, and especially the 1950s study on the authoritarian personality, as a phenomenon of mass society. So in the 50s, there is this distinct phenomenon that occurs, and Adorno and other Frankfurt School members, they write about what they call the culture industry. And so authoritarianism is kind of really imbricated in this conception. But I think the sort of the significance of this conception is that how they are trying to incorporate Freudian insights into the Marxian framework. So, I mean, if you made through that study, I mean, it's kind of lays out Freud's conception of infantile sexuality, the Oedipus complex, the castration complex, and that how it then plays itself out in the arena of society and in the arena of politics, where there is an issue of identification and counter-identification with authority. So Adorno's sophisticated insight into that project and in that study was that how individuals actually, unconsciously, they identify with authority. They like to identify with authority. And so if we bring in, now one thing that we emphasize in Platypus, in our reading group, in sort of the one important notion in Marxian approach is how to understand and adopt an immanent critique, immanent analysis, meaning that it has to grow from within. There has to be an element of self-reflection, self-analysis, and self-understanding. And so if you turn the lens inward, or it becomes immanent, then it offers a different picture of what authoritarianism is. It actually allows us to study it in a dialectical fashion. So it is self-contradictory. It is double-sided, right? And it is a social problem. So it's not about just authoritarianism of an individual or of one group, but rather authoritarianism as a problem of society. So once you begin to look at it that way, it actually allows us to analyze the problem differently and in a much more interesting way. Actually, it gives us a sort of an enriched understanding of this conception and phenomenon. So so immanent critique, I think, is crucial, and because that allows us to tap into the conception of authoritarianism in a self-contradictory way, right? It is not one-sided. It is not that the right is authoritarian, but rather authoritarianism is also the problem of the left. It is also the problem on the left, right? And so the point really is how to become conscious of that. and to be able to reflect on it. That's the question. That's the question that Adorno was trying to pose in the 1950s and the 60s when he is writing critiques of the left from the vantage of the left. So that was his imminent approach to understand the problem. So, as I also mentioned, the project of the culture industry that Adorno actually spent a lot of time analyzing and writing about. And so the culture industry, has anybody read? Or, yes?
Oh, just,
Yeah, okay. In which one of the things, or one of the main points that Adorno makes is the liquidation of the individual. Or to put it in Freudian terms, it is the liquidation of the ego, which is again a very Freudian insight that Adorno uses in this work. So the point really is that how, when you conduct an immanent critique, it allows you to make sense of the forms of appearances, because capitalism is a series of forms of appearances, necessary forms of appearances. And one has to work through those forms of appearances in order then to see that capitalism or the culture industry also points beyond itself. So if you have that understanding, you also see authoritarianism as a process or a phenomenon that points beyond itself. That it also has emancipatory potential. But how do you make those potentials available in society? And the way you make those available or become conscious of is through political struggles. Right? So in that sense, authoritarianism is the historical outcome of Marxism and its failures. And that was revealed through the emergence of mass democracies or mass society or culture industry, where it appears that there's democracy. Everybody's free. But what Adorno was saying, that it is a form of appearance. It appears, it necessarily appears that way, that, well, you have the right to choose. You know, there are all these ads, in the 50s and the 60s on the billboards, and people were like, oh, I have the power to choose, I have a power to make a decision. And so Adorno kind of taps into this, that how mass society, it gives the appearance that everybody is free, that there is democracy, but it's just a matter of appearance. Because there's a certain standardization that has occurred, and it also occurs in the realm of politics, and it gives this sense that you have individual freedom, individual independence. But behind it, if you start to analyze the problem, what you see is the liquidation of the individual. The individual is actually being dissolved in society. Right? It's being dissolved in the collective. And so that, for Adorno, actually was a problem. But it is a problem that can be worked through. Right? And so that's where the question or the conception of the left becomes important. So there is this hue and cry and a lot of criticism about Trump. If we now extend this analysis to our own present a little bit, where for some reason the Democrats and Hillary Clinton were misunderstood as the left, some kind of a democratic left, and Trump is interpreted of the right. Yes, okay. But what are these distinctions today? What do they mean today? The left and the right. Platypus claims that in the absence of the left, there is the absence of the left. The left died in the 1920s. And what we are experiencing is a very deep kind of social political regression And both Trump and Hillary Clinton, or the Republicans and the Democrats, are these regressive symptoms or expressions of that failure. So, in a sense, it seems that Trump probably is a useful problem to have. He's a useful problem to have because he is, in some ways, highlighting the contradictions, making them clearer. And also, he's neither from the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party. He is a capitalist. He's a conservative capitalist. You know, he is all about tactics. So in some sense, he is a clearer example, or he is clearly exemplifying the contradictions and the problems in society as compared to somebody like Clinton, who was actually obscuring the problem, obscuring contradictions. So, and Trump, yes, you know, he is a product of our society, and I thought I could, did anybody have a chance to look at this piece by Gordon? I mean, it's a really decent piece. It's pretty, it explains the problem well, and I thought I'd just read a couple of passages to emphasize a couple of things about the authoritarian personality. So all of these theories may explain some aspects of the Trump phenomenon, which is sufficiently complex as to defeat any single framework of analysis. Each of them, in fact, may hold a special appeal in different precincts of criticism. For the truth is that Trumpism holds a powerful fascination for its critics, precisely because it serves as an object for our negative self-definition. For his admiring crowds, Trump is refreshing precisely for his ineloquence, for his swagger, and for the allusions to violence that typically remain at the level of tough talk, though at times spill over into real action. But for his opponents, Trump seems to occasion a kind of hyper-eloquence, as if one could perform through language the mind's distance from mindlessness. For whatever it is, Trump is not us, and that is its hidden consolation. This is the moment of dishonesty in political criticism, that it forgets a negative cathexis against the enemy who permits us better to define who we are. Trump is indeed entertainment, but not only for those whom it entertains. If Trump enchants his supporters, he awakens a no less powerful fascination for the critics who loathe him, since love and loathing are only two sides of the same coin. So that is the dialectical conception of authoritarianism. Identification, counter-identification. Love, hate. You know, you love those, or you hate those whom you love. So I think Trump actually poses an interesting question about authoritarianism in all of us. We are all authoritarians. And I could probably leave it up there, and you know, if there are questions, we can open it up for discussion.
Anybody have any questions? Doesn't have to be about specifically what Autius like, you know, the readings, it could be about just in general.
Yes.
I think it's hard to think of Trump, especially with regards to authoritarian personality, because the study comes out of this like catastrophic moment where Hitler seems to have like destroyed the ideals of the Enlightenment and stuff like that. And so, in one way, there's a sense that the authoritarian, like this reading of Trump based on the authoritarian personality, feeds into the Trump as Hitler kind of narrative. It's like ultra right. But of course, the point of authoritarian personality looking at America rather than Europe as the supposed last bastion of liberalism or something like that, and still finding authoritarian traits would seem to, again, like you said, deal with the sort of dialectic conception of authoritarianism. I don't know. I don't really know what I'm asking, but I think it's hard to think of Trump without, like you said, his counterparts, whether it be Hillary, who's quickly fading from view, or let's say the rest of the Democrats, who are now more than ever exhibiting authoritarian tendencies. But I think that's just one thing to, I don't know, it's...
But I thought it was also interesting then how the authoritarian tendencies of society actually came to surface with the election of Trump, right? People in their self-conception or in their self-understanding, you know, resisting Trump, like what does it really mean? What are they resisting? I mean, he won the election, you know, fair and straight. People voted for him, right? Hillary lost, right? So, what was this uproar about? Like, who are they upset with? Right? Is it really Trump that they're upset with? Or another thing that happened was the infantilization by the Democrats of the people. The crying, the sobbing, the results of the election, you know, providing safe spaces to people. What is that about? Democrats just told people, oh, vote for us, we're going to win. He's a misogynist, he is this, he is that, he's going to lose. You know, we will protect you, we are going to win. And then they didn't win. And so the children were upset.
Well, and that's really, when we're talking about the authoritarian personality and identification, this idea of, for example, Hillary or the Democratic Party being the one who is going to protect you. That's, you know, precisely what we're talking about, right, is this sort of identification. You know. Go for it, please.
Yeah, there is also this, I mean, thinking also about Brexit, where the majority voted for Brexit, but then there's still people asking the parliament to intervene, so there is this so-called liberalism against populism. So there is this, the liberals against the people. There is this sense in the left that democracy is problematic because people are ignorant. So I feel there is an authoritarian tendency there, and they want like the status quo to like keep the populists and keep like the people away because they don't know, and the status quo knows.
Could we maybe talk about what came up in your presentation, which is this dialectical conception of authoritarianism, and the possibility of overcoming authoritarianism? Because I think when it comes to something like, for example, the election, the question that comes to me when I see protests is, okay, what will this do politically? And politically it amounts to either 1-0 or 2 supporting the Democrats, often on the basis of accepting kind of Donald Trump's claims, his assumptions, right? You know, and so then it's like, okay, well, what would it mean to support the Democrats in this situation? It would mean, well, I wish Hillary had won, and then it comes down to, okay, so what are the differences? And politically, it's hard for me to say that, you know, we should necessarily be saying that Hillary is the answer to Trump. You know, the Democrats have deported 3 million people. The Obama administration wanted to take away due process rights for immigrants, all of these things. So where is the potential, I guess, is there potential, or how can you, these authoritarian identifications with either Trump or Hillary, because I mean it exists on both sides, you know, people are like, well, I voted for Trump because I trust him, you know, I trust the Democrats to protect me from Trump, both of these things. So what would it mean to try and use kind of Adorno's method of critically grasping authoritarianism in order to overcome it? What you know, today, especially when it seems as though, okay, what are the politics we have? And they just seem inadequate, you know? I mean, it makes, like, I can sympathize with why people want to go out and protest Trump, but then when it comes down to what will this do, will this actually make people's lives better? Politically, it's just supporting the Democrats, and it comes from this authoritarian impulse as well. And so I can't see it as necessarily more justified, and I can't see it as the answer, you know?
And how do people begin to recognize the Democrats as authoritarian when they're precisely identifying authoritarianism with Trump directly? I mean, to the point that they're calling Trump a fascist. Like, that's in common, like, usage now to, like, call Trump a fascist. And so, I mean, like, from the get-go, like, people are going to have a very hard time, like, identifying, like, authoritarianism with the Democrats when they see that as, like, precisely the antidote to, like, their perceived authoritarianism within Trump.
Well, it's really ironic, too, because nobody called Trump a fascist back during the primaries. Like, I think everyone during the primaries was able to admit that, you know, Trump is, like, preferable to somebody like Ted Cruz. So, yeah, it comes across as very disingenuous to me when he only gets called a fascist when he, you know, is against the Democrats. And then when you ask, what are the real material differences for people's lives, it's not much.
Well, I think this is a good question, and I think the answer is not as the left today is kind of wishing for or attempting to do, is to reconstruct the Democrats or the Democratic Party. And I don't think that is a very productive or a fruitful exercise. If one has to raise critical consciousness, I think I would say what is required is a reconstitution of the international left. That's what is required. And in some ways, it seems to me that this moment occasions, provides an occasion to do that, because there is a crisis in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, and it does create a possibility for a reconstitution of the left.
How would we relate this to this idea of critical authoritarianism, or the critical value of authoritarianism?
Or the positive side, because you're thinking about authoritarianism as like a negative trait both in Democrats and Republicans, and the left has up to now.
Yeah, but like, for example, in the readings we did, right, they aren't testing people to see if they're authoritarians or not authoritarians. It's you are more or less authoritarian. Everyone is more or less authoritarian. So that it seems to be kind of the substance we have to work with. So on the basis of authoritarianism, because I think it's kind of hard to get, even from the readings, what precisely is meant by this sort of critical or positive value of authoritarianism.
Many people would take this to mean that we should try to control authoritarian instincts, and that's the way to go. So, and you're suggesting that we should overcome them on the basis of those instincts. So, and I don't understand what that means.
Yeah.
Well, I understand overcoming capitalism on the basis of capitalism, but I don't understand how it works with authoritarianism, for instance.
Well, I think that's where one has to try to make sense of it. One has to try to make sense of the social political phenomenon in a critical register. One has to make sense. One has to ask, what is it about Trump that is so disturbing to them? What is it? What is the aim of these protest movements? What is the meaning of resistance? You have to ask these difficult questions, and you have to answer them from the standpoint of the left, from the standpoint of Marxism. And in that sense, I think you do have to use that history, and also the history of authoritarianism in the 20th century, and how it is the failure of Marxist movements at different historical junctures that have given rise or has complexified this problem. It is, as we have kind of talked about, that how authoritarianism also is a problem in historical consciousness. It is a problem, or it kind of manifests this regressive subjectivity, regressive objectivity of our social form, of our society. And I think these are the questions that one will have to tackle in order to make better sense of the notion of authoritarian personality, the authoritarian form of society. I think that's what I would say.
it's also a different conception of politics, I think. So for example, there seems to be, like you said, this entirely negative conception of authoritarianism that Trump somehow embodies, and let's say, for example,
And then other people aren't. Yeah.
right, and that like no one else is. But for example, the obvious response is that for any sort of politics to have any sort of effect, there's some sort of authoritarianism that needs to be navigated or dealt with. And the idea that politics is a moral issue, politics is an ethical issue that, for example, is anti-authoritarianism generally needs to be rethought or needs to be kind of overcome on its own basis. Specifically in that, and I think part of that is, for example, when, like there's been a lot of pushback, for example, when Trump says that Chicago is a very violent city. And then there's these things posted on Facebook that are like, no, it's not a violent city. Well, yes, it is, right? And so like those things need to be dealt with in reality. So, for example, Trump might have the wrong answer to that. He might have conservative answers. And the same thing with the immigration bill that he's doing. It creates, a two-tiered immigration system. But these are the things that the Democrats actually wanted and couldn't pass because, in one sense, they weren't authoritarian enough, right? So, well, no, maybe not. But either way, they lack the political will to do that. And I think that in the end, the means aren't, actually the means are what differ, but the ends aren't. And so... Yeah.
Right, so if the end is to overcome authoritarianism, or to put it in a different way, if the end is to overcome capitalism, or capitalist authoritarianism, then I think we have to understand that it is not going to happen from the platform of the Democrats or the Republicans. It is only going to happen with the self-conscious home system, right? And so it is a political problem. And in that sense, yes, authoritarianism, there's a psychology to authoritarianism, but it is also a social political problem, right? And the right is not going to, the right doesn't have the consciousness to overcome it, or to see how it points beyond itself, right? So, and the Democrats are included in that. So in order then to push or advance our understanding of authoritarianism or the problem as it is manifested today, it can only be clarified, or one way of putting it would be that it is only through conscious Marxist movement that it can be clarified and it can be understood. And that's what, for instance, Reich was talking about, that the Marxists failed to do so, right? And that's how the problem actually persisted and was deepened in the 20th century. And then it took a new form of authoritarianism with the emergence of the new left in the 1960s, right? So actually, it's the left, that is kind of, that expresses this problem much more clearly. The right is incoherent. I mean, Trump is incoherent.
He doesn't need to be coherent.
Yeah. Trump is all about tactics, and yes, and the Democrats actually are also that. So that's what the right stands for. But when the left also depicts such features or traits or characteristics, then that should give us pause. Because that means that ideologically speaking, the left has degenerated. That instead of actually being the critical consciousness or the critical voice of society, the left has abdicated its responsibility. And that's when it becomes more complex. That's when the end goal, or the goal of changing society productively in an emancipatory way, becomes more obscure.
So in other words, the left is, or the perceived left, some people consider the Democrats, the so-called left, has taken on the character of subordinate to the perceived authoritarianism of the right.
Right, so I think it's important to understand that how authoritarianism is not the problem of the right, but it is the problem of the left. that's where it stems from.
People have questions, arguments? Go for it.
Yeah.
Could you maybe elaborate on the last sentence from your presentation? Like you ended on, we found out not only like Trump is authoritarian, we found out we are all authoritarian,
Yes.
something in that vibe.
Mhm.
And by that, did you mean that like Democrats are authoritarian, or like what?
Mhm.
Could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I would say that when I said that, what I meant was that our subjectivity is authoritarian. And if we understand authoritarianism in terms of subjectivity, objectivity, and then in that kind of a dialectical formulation, then it will not only appear as a social problem, as a social conception, but that everybody who participates in that social form or society has that element, right? Is a little authoritarian. And so when I was kind of referring to the emergence of mass society, the 20th century phenomenon, and that took on a very specific kind of, standardization of life, of material things, of individuality. And so the contradiction of authoritarianism in that period is that, there's a sense of liberal individuality. We all think, oh, we're very liberal, we're free, we have liberal ideas, et cetera. But also combined or the related factor or something that, that can only be understood in relation to authoritarian tendencies, right, of society as a whole. So that is the self-contradiction of authoritarianism. That if you look at this tension between the individual and the collective, or the individual and society, at the individual level it may appear, or it appears to us that, we're liberal, we're free, all of us have this sense about ourselves that, I'm independent, I make my decisions, I'm not conservative, etc. But we are all kind of also wedded to certain authoritarian tendencies that are part and parcel of our social existence and society. And that is a result, as I was trying to say, it may be a little bit difficult to wrap our heads around, but it is a result of certain failures of, failure of freedom, like society's inability to change itself, to transform itself into something post-capitalism, for instance.
Do you think the culture, it's well to be apparent that the culture is interested in authoritarianism, but would you say that the emergence of this kind of everyday authoritarianism, authoritarianism is big power rising in times of war, but kind of everyday, I don't know.
It's every day. It's everyday practices. It's on television. It's in music. It's in the newspapers. It's in the New Yorker. It's kind of there. Art. Yes. Yes. So,
Maybe it would be useful to have some examples of authoritarian narrative, authoritarian behavior in everyday life. Maybe some people are not familiar.
Examples?
Yeah.
So how I imagine it, for the culture industry, is the necessity of choosing product you're buying and your participation in consumption, but the fact that you are put in specific boxes and made to sort of when you exist through products,
Well, and there's also the content of, like, for example, in the culture industry, Adorno spends a lot of time talking about popular music. And even within, like, the way the music is made, what you see is a liquidation of kind of a relationship between the part and the whole. So, for example, in a popular song, you can kind of listen to any 10 seconds of it, and you might as well have listened to the entire thing. Because the idea is that the part justifies the whole, and the whole justifies the part. And this is the same way with, like, you know, the individual, the collective in an authoritarian society. So, for example, in the remarks on the authoritarian society in the background readings, they take this moment to talk about kind of the personality of the anti-Semite, and how the anti-Semite might say, by identifying with anti-Semitism, they are being an individual. And that's how they're being a strong, independent, kind of opinionated person, is by identifying with this, like, collectivity. And so they justify each other and affirm each other, and that's what it means when we talk about this liquidation, is that you can't find this sort of differentiated ego. And when he talks about kind of the regression of psychology as well, right? So we're just reactive. You can't have these experiences. That's also, I think, a function of the liquidation of this relationship between the individual and the collective. But yeah, I think you're right. But examples is also in, like, the content of music and stuff like that. I don't know if you guys had something else in mind with art.
Yeah, because that was just popular art. Looking at high art would be interesting.
But that's interesting because Adorno doesn't really, you know, he doesn't think that popular art or low art doesn't have the potential. You know, he doesn't make this distinction that only high art has the capacity to self-reflect and...
Yeah, high art has the same problem. I mean, he talks about it too. He's like, you know, Beethoven isn't let off the hook.
Right.
His music takes on the same character, even if we could say maybe when it was made, there was some sort of potential there, but it has the same issue. So the question is, you know, it's not, well, how can we get rid of this awful popular art, this awful mass culture? You know, the masses are bad and we're good.
I mean, the extreme repetition of, like, techno music may make you more critical about society, for example.
Or even if, like, avant-garde music, like Schoenberg, which Adorno goes back to a lot, like, is pointing beyond itself in a sense. It's a question of whether or not people can recognize what it's pointing beyond.
Yes, that's right. Like how do we really listen to music today? You know?
No, Schoenberg's not more avant-garde than anyone else.
We listen to Schoenberg like we listen to pop music, sort of.
Yeah, but then
Sometimes.
yeah,
We're
but
very lazy listeners at least.
Yeah, exactly. If anything, techno exemplifies the popular masses much more than Schoenberg does. So it's not necessarily the
Well, even
Yeah.
Schoenberg, you know, you'd, like, listen to it while, you know, I friends, and I mean, I do this too. It's not like I'm some sort of art aficionado who, like, does it. You know, I was like, oh, I have to write an essay. Let's just pop on some, like, you know, whatever. It could be hip hop. It could be pop music. It could be techno. It could be Schoenberg. Yeah, it's been Schoenberg before, so.
I think when it comes to art and music, I really like to think in terms of this relationship between the producer of art and the critics. You know, so I really like this period in art, especially in America, you know, when Jackson Pollock was producing art and Clement Greenberg was his critic. And how actually they were both kind of making each other smart. You know, they were both pushing the bounds of one another. So artists need critics. And I think the problem today is that we don't have critics. There's no critique of anything, of art. You know, and that's why art has become so insufferable.
Yeah, people just, you know, kind of pass judgment like it's good or bad. People think that it's critique to say something is bad. You know, that's not what critique is.
Which is then again, which points back to the problem of our authoritarianism.
negative affirmation.
Well, and that's exactly what we see, you know, Trump is terrible. Sure. But is this, in denouncing him, are you apologizing for the status quo? Are you apologizing for capitalism and the way things are? Because, you know, it's the task, I think, of a socialist or of a Marxist would be, you know, what is the potential for socialism actually in this change, in something like Trump? And
Yes,
if you just say he's bad, we want the Democrats who will do the same thing, but be Democrats about it. That's not, it's not particularly critical just because you denounced.
I mean,
Well, I don't know, this brings up kind of an interesting thing because, like, I mean, as like an SAIC student, like in a lot of critiques, I mean, I'm in the writing program, so like in workshops, like we get told to like avoid using language of good or bad when critiquing art, but like, I mean, in lieu of that, like the critique just ends up taking on like, I don't know, other like variations of good or bad to me, like like I don't know, pointing out, for example, like what like. It usually comes back to like sort of like moral implications a lot, or like it just like sort of reflects like very like present day notions of like what's being like politically achieved, so called, or like what is or even when it's like the like I don't know, a formal question, like again like the forms that are called into question are very like
No, but it's exactly what you're saying. That these ontological categories end up being good or bad is a sign of authoritarianism. It's the fact that you
it's authoritarianism
It's
within
well,
like
if
the
you want
critique
to
of the form itself,
cultivate
not
this,
like whether
like-
or not it's like overcoming like the forms with which we're like trying to like redirect the work.
Well, in the sense that you should have this kind of collective morality. You know, because people will say things. I mean, I saw my friend made this post today. Well, he said some things are just solved questions, and it's, you know, this list of kind of identity-based moral claims. It's like, okay, so everyone just has to speak the right way. That's not, you know, it's like,
Language.
it's not going to change anything.
So one thing,
It's not changing the actual conditions
that
of
is
society.
also discussed in culture industry and the authoritarian personality it's kind of there, is the issue of conformism. That you just conform. You become this conformist individual. But what appears to be the case is that no, you are actually making a choice and you are deciding and you have the freedom to do so. But it is kind of masked. It's masked by this very conformist principle that is kind of integral to the logic of culture industry.
This was going to be my response to your question, for example, that an example of authoritarianism on the left would be anti-racism, where everyone is expected to, let's say, perform the same sort of anti-racist gestures,
Yes.
which don't necessarily have any sort of political content. But it's very easy to say, you know, you want black people to be equal, you want whoever to be equal.
You just
And
absolve yourself of like
Exactly.
guilt for the way things are, and that's another form of apology for the
and
like
it's
just
much more authoritarian to say, you know, all racists are bad, rather than trying to work through the problem of why we're in this current situation, or why there exists a difference between races, or why.
exactly. It's like, how can we overcome something like this?
Exactly. That doesn't point towards its overcoming, which would be its imminent critique. But of course, that requires an understanding that no, there is a difference between racial categories at this time. So just to say, for example, that all races are equal, you know, in some sense it negates the problem. And things like that do come up a lot on the left. So, you know, and this can be, you know, analogized to race, gender, sexuality, anything.
And also bringing it back to like this like I don't know, like neurotic like anthropologizing of like white people and like what's wrong with white people and what white people are doing wrong, and like it also takes on this very like authoritarian character, and also like derails it completely from like the problems of like I don't know, like conditions of people, like of, you know, black people in this country, for example. Like I don't know. I mean, at least like SAIC, again, like I've noticed the rhetoric like constantly just going back to the sort of like self-deprecation of white people, like, which like again is like very authoritarian in character, or like negative sort of, I guess, authoritarianism.
Yes. So I'm a fan of internet drama, so I know plenty of examples of authoritarianism.
Exactly.
Like it's not that I don't like haven't seen this in action. I'm more like interested in like precise character. Like, would you identify authoritarianism, for example, with overarching moral claims? Like, is having overarching moral claims a problem in and of itself?
Overarching
Moral claims.
Yeah, having moral claims that are like indisputable or like one
Such
has
as?
to be
such as, can you specify?
yeah, like the example of gender, like being like all genders equal, or like supporting like certain forms of, I don't know, expression. They don't say that because it's ableist. Don't use that type of language.
Yeah.
Or like
I mean, in terms of language, I mean, from my experience, it's authoritarian in the sense that there is lag and dogma that we need to accept, that these words are offensive, we don't need to discuss this anymore. So there is this simplification of the discourse, and people don't want to talk about context, and so they simplify things, and I think that's authoritarian to prevent discourse and to say that we as a group decided that this is the case. So
Yeah, it's an example of, politically correct.
so, for example, I'm a mod for a group that's called that's about identity politics, where Americans like incorrectly map it onto other nations, and we had to like switch on mod like post approval. And one guy from Australia comes and starts rant about how Americans never get that in his language, cunt is not offensive. It's not a swear word. And that was not a post I approved. Do you think like I should have approved it? My reputation was that this guy completely misses the point of communication. The language is not only his, but the recipient's what he's talking about. The fact that his cool community does not consider the word cunt offensive is irrelevant.
it's relevant in the sense that you wouldn't call him sexist for using the word, for example. Now, whether he should use it towards American people, I mean, there should be a discussion and explanation of that. The meaning of the word is not independent of its context, basically. So, and those are debates and discussions that need to be had. So, in just banning the word out of hand, I think it's a problem, in my opinion.
That expresses a problem, that it's right. I mean, what you're saying is actually expresses a larger problem in social media. And actually, what it is expressing is that how people self-censor. They self-edit, self-censor, because you're not free. You're not free to say anything you want to say, because of this groupthink. We really are in the depths of this group mentality, the herd mentality, where you can be exiled from your community for saying something, which has happened to a lot of people. And social media, I think in some ways, is a very clear example of this kind of authoritarianism that persists and exhibits itself in our society.
There are techniques to like administer like control over wording that are much more efficient than social media, basically. I mean,
Yeah, because you could just block certain words and then they just won't show up. You don't even have to have a person.
But you can also take screenshots and forever and ever have an evidence of this person saying such.
Yes, right, right.
Which is like a power technique and a tool that can be used.
Yeah.
But should it be used? Should you screenshot what somebody said? And, I mean, then this becomes like surveillance society.
Yes, exactly.
There was a new Google tool that they're testing now about like measuring the toxicity of words automatically. It was a video I watched. I mean, it's not working very well yet, but I mean, I believe in the future there can be and again, this ranking of words in terms of their offensiveness, and it's just very...
It's scary.
Yeah, it's scary and simplifying the way language works. So.
Yes,
Well, and I think there's also the question of under what conditions authoritarianism would actually pose a problem or an opportunity for the left. And if you think about the left in the United States as having been involved, and potentially in the future being involved in a politics aimed at taking governing power in the US and around the world, then the question really is, under what conditions would issues like these become a problem? And what solutions would be adequate to that goal? And so it's not to say, any technique would necessarily be adequate or inadequate, but how would a politics that would necessarily have to be a mass politics work through this problem? And I would imagine, like conceivably, the problem would manifest and the solutions would appear in ways that are quite different from, Facebook group moderation.
Right.
So, there could be, perfectly authoritarian solutions that don't have anything to do with the left, that one should apply, if one's goals are other than a socialist politics. But I think thinking about the problem in that way, like what, again, if you're actually trying to organize a mass political party for socialism, when these issues would come up in the course of politicizing and organizing entire swaths of society, well beyond, the relatively small, kind of post-academic milieu that's very active in social media today, how would the problem manifest then? And I don't know, but I think that's maybe the way to think about the problem for the left.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
You wouldn't be able to reject all Trump voters, that's for sure.
Right. You'd have people using a lot of words.
Exactly.
And you'd have to figure out, not just giving that pass necessarily, but, how are you going to work with that when you get people of varying backgrounds?
Well, it's the question of how can you overcome something like this, right? Like how do people, quote unquote, overcome their racism? So in the early, the Socialist Party in the United States, back when it existed, they had these unions in the South, many of which were interracial, right? And so the idea was that by working together and seeing, that you have these similar interests, you kind of force practically these people to, at least on some level, overcome their racism, right? Maybe they still use words that, some people wouldn't prefer, but it's, if you politicize someone, as people do today, on the basis of identity, I think it just makes perfect sense that they will become politicized on the basis of identity, So if you are politicizing people on the basis of race, then it makes sense that you will get white nationalism. I don't see why this is, particularly a strange thing to assert, but to some people it does seem to be. And so, it's okay, what is the actual basis for overcoming something like racism, like sexism, all of these things? And, I think it's, socialism, it's human freedom, it's the way in which we are able to relate to each other universally.
So then where does question of politicizing people on the basis of labor come in? And is that in and of itself a means of politicizing people against identity?
That's hard, I think, because today people, they break it up into they these different sociological groups based on, and it becomes an identity. I've had people tell me before, when I was talking to other leftists on this campus, that their aesthetic is working class, and they want to shove it in people's faces.
Which is identity.
Which is an identity, yeah. It's treated as an identity.
Labor into identity.
It's just another way to kind of fit into that. And the entire point of socialist politics would be actually we want to overcome this sort of working class. We want to overcome this immediate position. Go ahead.
What's missed is that, for example, what you said about the unions integrating race into their practice, let's say, that's become mostly normal. So, for example, I work at this financial tech company that hires a large amount of black people just to do the basic tech work, but it's the new kind of working class work. and they like process loans and like whatever, and it's missed in a lot of ways that, like, for example, the politically correct language that we ascribe to leftism, and of course to like Hillary Clinton and whatever like confused state of leftism that is already the corporate status quo, and so there's no reason that that's any farther to the left than what already exists in like current corporate culture. And so, for example, after the election of Trump, we had this meeting that was about like, what was it? It was like post-Trump like diversity meeting or something, and they said it like wasn't a political meeting, but it was about the election of Trump, and so everyone was like, what the fuck are we talking about? And then so they started talking about like how we don't want our friends to get deported, but there's like not really any immigrants at the job besides very high-ranking Indian like tech workers who are probably not in any danger of like getting deported anyway. So the whole thing was just so confused, and it's precisely this lack of kind of political understanding of the identity politics that's already implicit in the corporate workspace. And no one uses any sort of, you know, corporate language. All the black people are very aware that they're being exploited, but it's not able to be articulated in any way because it's already there. It's already assumed that like, oh no, we're equal, it's fine.
Yeah, because we speak the right way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a way of kind of getting past actual, like, you know, kind of political injustices or whatever that still exist as well if we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's also an easy thing to do and feel you're being political. And it starts from the whole, the person is political, it becomes about
This reminds me
personal
of,
morality,
you know,
personal behavior. And
Bayard Rustin writes about this in the 60s, and then in his work in 1970, which is a critique of the Black Power turn and Black nationalist politics, but this idea that like protest is like a means of these people kind of feeling better about their own impotence politically and their own inability politically. You know, so that in the absence of the ability to actually make any sort of meaningful political change or to take actual political action, these sort of like symbolic protest politics, and we could, I think, generalize it to other symbolic gestures, such as, you know, well, I won't say cunt because I respect women. You know, that becomes a stand-in for, and an apology for the inability politically to do something like, say, legalize sex work so that sex workers are not criminalized, or to, you know, overcome capitalism.
yeah, there is a disproportionate attention being paid to these issues of like manners. And
the Grammys, the Oscars, whatever language. It's like misread as politics.
The Oscars, yeah.
Oh yeah, the Oscars thing.
I'm sure Mona is a very good movie, as I suspect. But anyway, I mean, 12 Years a Slave was not a good. No, though neither La La Land is a very good movie. But so yeah, it seems to be. But yeah, in general, the Oscar seems to be just choosing on the basis of identity. So that Trump won this year, so we need to give a lot of Oscars to Black people, for example. So I mean, there are all that kind of politics, pseudo politics.
Yeah. Right.
And about there was what there is said earlier about the impotence. I really find it a lot with the anti-fascist left. So where I come from, there was this subculture in a square in my hometown, and it was like the spot where the left was hanging out. So there are huge demonstrations to prevent fascists from coming, because there is like a fascist party there. And so it was a big event, and everybody was like, they measured the success of the events by the amount of people coming, and that there were more than them, stuff like that. In the end, after a few months after these events, these successful victories, the capitalists just took over the area, and they basically they changed it. What's the term when you
Gentrify?
Yeah, they gentrified the area that is so. And in some sense, I think that the left just chooses to fight fascism because it's a much easier enemy, because most people agree that fascism is bad, so they have the opportunity to be more than them and show them
Well, this is precisely that sort of like narcissistic, I want to see myself reflected back in the world around me. That, and then, identification.
That's what, like the in the Adorno Marcuse exchange in the 60s on student politics, or Habermas coined the term left fascism, right? That how it's the left that is exhibiting all these fascistic tendencies in boycotting.
They're fascinated by the fascists. They use the same tactics. It's gang warfare almost in some parts of Europe between fascists and left.
So I think it's sort of more important to study fascistic tendencies that exist on the left, because that helps clarify, what the stakes are, political stakes. I think in what we were talking about just a few minutes ago about social media and language and identity politics, I think they all point to a certain poverty of our political consciousness.
There's a way to accept the worst of Trumpism. So, for example, I see a lot of people that generally think themselves as liberal to basically post the worst things that the Trump administration is doing, and then on one side to kind of express this sort of despair, maybe anger, whatever, but nothing really comes out of it. And in a sense, I mean, it's like what you said at the beginning, that it's not imminent, right? It affirms it negatively. It says that, this is what's wrong. And it might, right, the only alternative is the Democrats, or any sort of kind of resistance to it. But it's not necessarily thinking about why that impulse is necessary in the world today. So, for example, to combat, urban violence, unemployment, anything like that. So, for example, when Trump says that there's millions of people that are unemployed, he's not wrong.
He's not wrong.
Right. Yeah. And, will he do anything to fix it? No, not in a socialist sense. Of course not. We have to be clear about that. But you can't do that.
He'll implement some policies. He's trying, that's what he's about.
So the issue is not about taking sides, about being pro-Trump or against Trump, but trying to understand Trump and work through the Trump phenomenon.
And is there, where does there exist, right, in today, or in the now, the potential for socialist politics? And the left does not think about that. And as long as the left doesn't think about that, what can you do?
Or they understand socialist politics to be fighting Trump at the moment.
Well, and what that means, because fighting Trump could mean a million different things, right? Taken in a vacuum, but what that means here, like today in our timeline, whatever, is that you are supporting the Democrats. That's what it means,
right?
And so then it's like, well, what's the point? This is not going to solve any of these problems.
But it ends up being nostalgia for Obama, or whoever, or even Reagan, right? It ends up being nostalgia for the 80s and the 90s.
Or wishing some other Republican had won, like, you want Paul Ryan, really?
There was petitions to Paul Ryan to...
Yeah.
Or George Bush or McCain. I mean, all of a sudden they're very sympathetic figures because they seem like the cultured old guys or whatever. It's that are nice.
Or people are saying we didn't think it could get worse than Bush. But
exactly. It's oh man.
It's the left and these intellectuals are supposed to, they're supposed to rip the blinds from the eyes of the wise guys, but they are the wise guys.
Right.
Basically, Obama did many of the things that Trump continues to do. I mean, he used many executive orders. He used a lot of this. He had this technocratic authoritarianism type of.
But one thing that happened under Obama, and now we're paying the consequences of that, is the deep politicization that occurred under Obama. It kind of defanged the left. It just, there was this inertia, and I think that's the problem that we're reading from today. And so it kind of now expresses itself in this incoherent ways now. Protest here, Trump is the problem, Democrats failed, that sucks, it's just all incoherence is being let loose. But I think still it can be a productive moment. And think it's an opportune moment for, you know, any self-conscious Marxist left to kind of reflect and, you know, do something. So I think in that sense, Trump does present some kind of an opportunity. You know?
Well, it can. I think.
It can.
Yeah, it's the question of how do you turn like a liability into an asset, right? Like,
Right,
there is
exactly.
the opportunity exists. The question is the left and subjective consciousness.
Yes.
Will it actually be
Yes.
able to turn this into an opportunity? Because otherwise, it won't be an opportunity. If the left doesn't do anything,
That's right.
then it will just be
Exactly.
another in a long line of disasters.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
And the question is how the country was depoliticized.
Mhm.
So immediately what I thought of was, for example, that the criticisms that the right had of Obama were instantly cast aside as being like racism against Obama, mostly racism against Obama, right? So there was no idea that the Republicans could actually have any sort of political ideas at all, and that it was in fact all apolitical and all a function of just racism and hatred and xenophobia and whatever. And that neglects the problem just as much as, you know, Trump does or anyone else, you know. And so again, it's this idea of how politics and specifically state governance is a negotiation of societal conflict and not necessarily just one party or one person doing what they want, right? It's a negotiation, it's a mediation.
I kind of want to go back on the point raised earlier, about like the issue of morality, like as in, you know, what is the relationship of politics and morality to authoritarianism? Is it that it's authoritarian, that a morality that politics derives directly from morality, or is like the existence of this social form we call morality itself authoritarian, indicative of authoritarianism? Like, you know, even outside of identity politics, like if we say, you know, murder is bad, murder is morally wrong, is that like, you know, can we not derive politics from that? Or if we say that freedom is good, right, which like we do, I think we do have this sort of moral sense of freedom, and we derive like a politics based on freedom from that, is that not, you know, also authoritarian? And if we pass judgment, you know, on like whether something is good or bad, based on this authoritarianism, like we're still passing judgment on whether or not it's good or bad. We might just say that everything is bad because everything is authoritarian. But, you know, so what's the difference? Is it, well, is it because, like, that's the only way that, you know, we're self-critical about our authoritarianism? You know, that, you know, we say we want freedom and that's authoritarian, and that's the way in which we're all authoritarian. But at the same time, that's the only way that can be overcome. Or,
And to piggyback on that, like, does, like, this, like, do the category, like, these, like, categories of morality, like, liquidate, like, the question of necessity with authoritarianism?
The question of morality, what?
Of necessity. Like, does like, this, the morality of, like, from which our politics can be derived, like, and like, I mean, as Ashley said, like, authoritarian, like, if everything's authoritarian, then everything's bad, but, like, that sort of, like, supersedes, like, the question of, like, the necessity of authoritarianism that we were speaking to earlier. How there, like, is inherently authoritarianism in any form of politics that is to emerge. So in that sense, it's necessary.
Well, so can morality. I think morality changes. You know, morality changes under like the given social conditions. It is a social problem. It is socially constituted. So morality, I think, has changed from one historical moment to another. And in our context, in the present, of course, it takes a different form. You know, and yes, there is a politics of morality as well. And so the point really is that under the constraints or the conditions of capitalism, what does it look like? Right? And of course it is also politically bound. So because we live, the form of politics that is available to us is conservative, is right-wing, and that actually allows for a certain conception of morality to be constituted, to exist. right? And it exists in the form of this identity politics, in the form of this political correctness, in the form of, I don't know, conceding to the issues of diversity, issues of, I don't know, not hurting people's feelings, etc., etc. It's just like, it's kind of, it's a little bit insane, I would say. So I think it changes. It changes under set of political and social conditions. And whether there is a morality of authoritarianism, yes, and I think it is problematic, right? And I think it's kind of interesting, or it's helpful to make sense of it in our context, because it's kind of always posed as a moral question. Everything is posed as a moral question rather than as a political question. Even a political question is posed in the register of morality. And I think it kind of obscures the issue sometimes. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, one thing I want to add to kind of get to Stephanie and to, I think, help with Ashley's question is that the question isn't whether authoritarianism is good or bad. It's not like authoritarianism is bad. Everything is authoritarian, and the question, I think, goes to what Stephanie brought up, which is what actually is the necessity of authoritarianism, right? And I think this relates to the question of Bonapartism as well.
How the might liquidate its necessity.
Yeah. Well, and that,
Yet it exists.
the authoritarian state and authoritarianism really is an example of the necessity, it's an expression, it's a phenomenon of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat within capitalism, right? The way in which the state has to kind of insert itself into civil society, right, in this authoritarian way. And it doesn't always, right, appear at the level of the state, but I think that's one way to think about it, right, when Adorno talks about what's the critical value of authoritarianism. It's not authoritarianism is good or authoritarianism is bad. It is, how can we grasp it critically? Because one-sidedly, of course, it's like terrible. It's a catastrophe like everything else.
Right.
But, how can we, on its own basis, overcome it? And the answer, I think, for a Marxist would be the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. What is the productive implication of authoritarianism? Right, and that would be in the politics of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Which we can't even really consider, right, what that would look like or what that would be, because there is no leftist politics today, But
we can look at both sides of authoritarianism today. So, for example, not only fascism, but how is the welfare state authoritarian? And something that we would, again, be nostalgic for in the age of Republic or in the age of Trump is like this idea that, like, if only we were all taken care of. But at the other point, that's not freedom in a sense. It's not any sort of political.
And the left shouldn't be automatically aligned with it, which
Right,
it does seem to be.
But it does seem to be.
It claims, well, the welfare state is, of course, more left than anything else.
And again, the idea that, there's this, like, image of the crazy wacko in the middle of America who just, like, wants his guns and to be left alone. And in one sense, he just wants freedom. And so, like, there's, like, again, this, like, sort of kernel of truth, as we like to say in Platypus, that, like, he doesn't want the welfare state to take care of him. And there might be a healthy impulse for him to say that, like, the state shouldn't take care of me and I want to take care of myself. That's not necessarily anything better, and he might have to oppress other people to do that. And there's something authoritarian in that. But, again, the idea that, like, we should all just be, given money or whatever is not necessarily freedom. And it might be just as authoritarian as, Weimar Germany.
It's like we can't have civil society, basically. Civil society can't work, and we need the state to take care of ourselves because we can't regulate our relationships.
Right, it's the crisis of civil society.
Like to say that you can just like magically distribute the wealth of capitalism to suit the needs of everybody is just reproducing the contradictions of it, and also I don't know, sort of naturalizing an idea that capitalism can resolve itself, which is also authoritarian.
I guess I wanted to raise maybe a kind of bigger picture question about historical shifts in our relationship to authority. Because if we take, as we've been discussing, authoritarianism as a subjectivity and as one characterized by a kind of love-hate relationship to authority, I think in some of the realms we've discussed, like that plays out in political authority, kind of hatred of any political authority, which is right on the left, or alternatively, the love of experts for expertise sake, or the love of the great leader, that sort of thing. We discussed this in politics. In morality, I think it's clear also how this plays out in the sense of, a love of a kind of uncritical embrace of moral authority, and then a casting off of moral authority as if that makes one, more free or less authoritarian. So there's that love-hate relationship as well, and certainly with respect to cultural authority and people's relationship to cultural notions of expertise and criticism. So if we take all these phenomena as kind of diverse expressions of authoritarianism in our kind of mass subjectivity, and inevitably so, I guess I'm just wondering, what would it look like then to speak of a roughly pre-1920s subjectivity in relation to authority? Like, can we say, and is this authoritarianism just kind of given a name in the 20s and 30s, or is it in a sense an undercurrent that only manifests most clearly then, but is essentially in existence prior to that period, perhaps post-industrial revolution? And is there a subjective relation to authority historically that does not manifest this kind of like love-hate ambivalence that one can point to, like just a different relation to political or moral or cultural authority?
I think that problem was manifested in Bonapartism. Like pre-1920s, if we want to go back in history, historically speaking, the problem of authoritarianism kind of emerged with Bonaparte, when there was this sense of identification with Napoleon Bonaparte, and it happened at the level of the masses, at the level of the people, then that kind of relationship of, loving authority and hating authority, I think, was being expressed. But I think that problem in some ways changed. Of course, it had a very different kind of character in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, and especially after the 1920s, 30s, it expressed itself very differently in society because, different kinds of cultural expressions and technologies that became available to individuals at the level of society.
But I think Adorno is also, doesn't he also make an argument that there's been like a regression in the way that the problem presents itself? Like, for example, he talks about how, like Freud could say in the late 19th century that there exists like an ego and an id and a superego, right? And that this plays a role in anti-Semitism. Or one could say that there was like, the political dimensions of Bonapartism. There was a Marxist left dealing with Bonapartism, right? And then Adorno talks about how if it seems to, like psychologists as though actually people just react, kind of their brains just react to stimuli, and actually Freud's wrong, that's because of a regression of like the psyche. So is Adorno saying that there has been kind of a regression of the problem of authoritarianism based on kind of the failure of the Marxist left?
Right. Yeah, but regression occurred in the 19th century too.
Yeah.
Like Bonaparte
Partism is in a regression. Okay.
Within Marxism.
So this like particular like Bonapartist like regression that we're talking about, like the point at which like authoritarianism takes on a character of like wish/fear that like Chris often talks about. Like I mean, like it goes back to sort of like the love-hate thing that like Chris is always talking about. Like with Trump, like there's this like obvious like wish-fear fulfillment sort of like relationship.
Yeah. So
to authoritarianism. Oh, that just this character of authoritarianism emerged with like Bonapartism, because like going back to what you said earlier about like authoritarianism takes on this specific character with the failure of Marxism.
Right.
Well, the failure of 1848. So that's like what Bonapartism is.
So I mean, authoritarianism is an expression of regression. It's an expression of regression within Marxism. regression on the left.
It's the inability of society to lead itself that
Mhm.
leads to authoritarian leaders having to continue. And for identification with those authoritarian
That's
leaders.
right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, okay, so the question is like, is this 1848 or is it Jacobins, Cromwell, you know, kind of the even previous bourgeois?
Yeah, because the authoritarianism of the Jacobins being the failure of the Jacobins.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if it's that's quite the case with the Jacobins. I don't know.
I mean, we like the terrorism of the
No, because maybe they were changing the world. I don't really know the history.
I know.
I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But in any
Just
case,
what we
it's a
read
history of
in
authoritarianism.
Trotsky.
And as you said, it's the failure of democratic movements that leads to authoritarian tendencies.
A little Marxist.
Marxist, yes.
Sure.
So would it be that, like, broadly you could say that, like, bourgeois consciousness was characterized by the ability to relate to or recognize authority without necessarily having the identification, counter-identification dynamic going on?
So at one point that was consistent,
Plausible.
and then it becomes contradictory.
I mean, it would certainly be like an example of like de-bourgeoisification that we like can't like recognize without identifying like the authoritarian character. Like, I mean, not only like Trump, but the Democrats as well.
Well, I mean, I think the character of authoritarianism has changed historically, right? If we do go back to 1848, Bonaparte, the 19th century, of course it looked different. It was, but I think if we use Freudian insights and if we use especially the categories or the conception of identification with authority and counter-identification, I think that can still be used to make sense of the problem of authoritarian personality in our context. I think that's what the study kind of tried to do, like key into his insights about that, especially.
Doesn't it also show a degradation of the individual psyche in the sense that, and this is probably true of Freud as well, but in one sense that Freud was able to tease out social aspects from the individual, whereas Adorno concedes that he's less able to do so, and that a failure of the study is that they rely on individuals to such a degree. Or that in one sense, he has to make that distinction apparent, whereas, for example, in the, let's say, like 19th century bourgeois individual, there was, the what? 19th century bourgeois individual that Freud, treated. There's at least some sort of consistency. So
Right, well, Freud, I guess one thing that we should be clear about is
wasn't
that...
a Marxist. So.
And Freud was a doctor.
Right.
He's a clinician.
Yeah.
He's treating patients.
Sure.
He's treating individuals. It was not his intention to apply psychoanalysis to society. And I think Adorno is also very clear about that. It cannot be applied to society. But one can use the insights of his clinical work to understand some of these social phenomena. But the intention is not to psychoanalyze society. I think they are very clear about that. So we also should keep that distinction in mind.
Anything else? If not, we can wrap up. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Asia.
Thank you.
Hopefully I can't tell if this entire video was sideways or not.